Monday, folks. Welcome to Ask Elvis. Roll the sting. What's up, guys? These runs are getting harder and harder. Today is the first time I've been running in the daylight for a long time because I actually set my alarm at 6 AM this morning to get up and failed miserably. I was too weak. I just couldn't get out of bed at 6 AM. It was raining, it was pitch black, but I'm pleased to say I've managed to fit one in now. Right, loads of you sent in some wonderful questions again, as always, so as I always say, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much to all of you who've done that. I've answered a lot of them already online, but some of them I thought would be really good to share. So today we've got a bunch of them from that list. Right, sorry, I'm all out of breath. I'll try and do a quick one now, and then I'll jump in the shower and reset myself, and we'll do some more. Okay, here's a good one from Edward. He says, "Hey Mark, could you give us an insight into what type of data teams collect and how they use them to evaluate driver performance? Particularly, in dogs. Particularly relevant question because, of course, we've had a bunch of teams recently evaluating drivers for race seats in 2019, and I guess the most notable of those and the most recent of those perhaps was Robert Kubica, wasn't it, signing for Williams for a year. So what do the teams assess and how do they collect that data? Well, they collect data on pretty much everything. There are probably around about 200... Oh, for God's sake! Oi, come here! Come here, now! Stop the barking. No barking. Pharrell, come here. Come here. No barking. Okay? Stop it, both of you. Try and do a video here. Now, come on. Right, down you get. Off you go. Off you go. Right, where were we? Teams collect on a car around about 200 channels, different channels of data from everything from tyre pressures that we know about, suspension movements, positions, brake pressures, brake temperatures, brake pad positions. I mean everything. And the number of sensors on an engine and power unit are just mind-blowing. There are a huge number of those, of course, measuring absolutely everything. So temperatures, pressures, positions, distances, I mean everything you can imagine on a Formula One car is measured in some way. Now, what a team can do from that, by analysing that data and by overlaying the data from one driver to that of another driver, is they can really build up a picture of how that driver is performing on track. And of course you can match that with the lap times. Excuse me. Hello? Thanks, mate. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. That's the guy who's coming to pick up the Range Rover that I've had on loan all week, coming to take it away today. That's going to be a sad moment. Love that Range Rover. Anyway, Edward, I'm really sorry. This is taking forever to answer this question, isn't it? They will look at the lap times, of course. Now, the lap time is perhaps one of the most important parts of any data set when evaluating a driver. Excuse me, of course, the driver's lap time is crucial to judging his performance. How fast is he? How fast can he push this car that we're giving him? And then particularly, how fast can he push this car compared to somebody else in the same car, compared to our other drivers, for example. So that's an absolutely critical piece of information. But what they can do is also look at the data to get an idea of things like consistency. You know, is he taking exactly the same line to within centimetres around the corner of the lap they did before? Consistency is crucial. How is he driving the car in terms of protecting his tyres? How good he is at that? And of course, you can pick up that kind of information from the data. Is he spinning tyres out of corners? Is he gentle on his throttle application? Is he very smooth on his and progressive on his brake pedal application? You know, how is his brake pedal application compared to somebody else? Is he aggressive in the early part of the braking phase, then tailing off towards the end, or is it the other way around? And and coming in towards the apex of a corner, is he gradually coming off the brake pedal on a really progressive and steady fashion that really looks after the tyres and prevents lock-ups happening? We know in modern Formula 1 that either brake lock-ups or wheel spin at the rear of the car on exit of corner destroys tyres. That's the absolute the worst way to look after tyres in a modern Grand Prix. So you need a driver that can do that. Lap time, of course, one particular lap time is great in terms of measuring qualifying performance. You know, most drivers can deliver a great lap time, but can they sustain that over a Grand Prix distance? And that's really when the data comes into play. You know, and a long stint in the car, does his concentration start to wane? Does he start to veer off those consistent racing lines that he was doing up until that point? Do the lap times start to tail away? Does he start to slip up slightly on braking? Does he start to just pinch tyres in the braking zones? Has he got the mental capacity to be doing all of the things that you have to do when driving a car, but then start playing with switches when the radio call comes in to make a change? Can he change ERS settings? Is he quick to react to the beep in his ear when it comes to opening things like DRS flaps? There is so much to learn and to be able to manage in the car as a Formula 1 driver in the modern age, that the lap time is only a tiny part of what you see. So the team have a huge amount of data, and that's why sometimes you can be watching the TV looking at lap times, that's pretty much all the data that we get as a viewer, and have a false impression of what a driver's like, and what a team sees within that driver is very different. They also have data on the driver itself, so health and fitness data, and that can also provide quite a nice insight into that driver's physical state. Is he able to cope with the demands of a Grand Prix season? You know, the heat and the humidity of places like Malaysia, and then the dry heat of places like Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, and the intensity of Singapore and Monaco. And all of this stuff goes to building a big, detailed picture of a driver. And because teams have so much data on all of their drivers and all of their past drivers, they have benchmarks to be able to compare them to. And that's where they're able to get a really nice idea, and detailed and much more in-depth idea than we can ever see just from looking at them on the TV on a Grand Prix weekend, as to how a driver might perform, and therefore gives them a better way to make that decision when it comes to deciding who's going to be driving their cars. I'm sorry that was so long-winded, Edouard, so I hope that helps a little bit. Right, give me a moment, I'm going to go and jump in the shower because I am just knackered, just about catching my breath. I'll be back in a minute. Right, that's better. Right, stand by. Right, one thing I just thought as well, just to finish off on Eduard's question that's taken most of this video already. Of course, with all that data, they correlate that with the driver's feedback, which is also an absolutely crucial part of making any driver decision, along with all the commercial arrangements and considerations and any finance and all the other things. But your question was about data, so I hope I covered most of that. But there is much more to a driver decision than just the simple fact of being in a car and what the driver does within that car. Anyway, let's move on and rattle through some more. Stuart Grindlay says, hi Mark, what are your thoughts on having a ballast-based championship, i.e. you gain 1 kilo for every 10 points you score in order to give a chance to prevent a runaway leader? Do you know what? I mean, it could work, couldn't it? It's worked in other championships. One of the things we want most in Formula 1 is close racing. We want to keep the field close. We want to see drivers battling it out on a Sunday afternoon for the top spot. And that is one way of doing it. So if we decide that we are going to somehow, as a Formula 1 group, if we're going to manipulate the championship a little bit and we're going to force close racing, well, that is one proven way to do it. I actually think it's one of the best ways to do it if we are going to go down that route, because you get the best team will score will take a lead in the championship, then be pegged back a little bit by that ballast situation. You add some ballast to your car, which slows you down, of course. Then that team still has the engineering freedom to be able to go out and still push for even more and more advantages, even though they might be smaller and smaller. So it still opens the way for a bit of innovation, a bit of ingenuity on an engineering front, and the margins become smaller and smaller that team has available to them. And of course it does, just by its very essence, mean that the cars with less ballast on them that are chasing them from behind will be faster, or will be closer rather, to the leaders. So it can make for a good race. So yeah, I kind of think if we're going to go that way and force closer racing through some kinds of technical or regulatory means, it's not a bad way to do it. Right, Pabsy H says, "Hi Mark, great channel. I've been subscribed since day one." Thank you very much, Pabsy. Well done. I hope it's progressed in the way that you hoped it would. But thank you very much for staying with us for so long. Great. He said, "I heard somewhere that Williams were adapting the car for Robert. Would that be just a steering wheel thing, perhaps? So what would they change?" Good question. Okay, so Robert has movement and use of both hands. However, the movement and the use of his right hand is heavily restricted. Now, on a Formula 1 car, for most drivers, you have complete use of both hands, of course, same strength capabilities, same movement capabilities. And what would happen in those situations is that the driver's steering wheel, for example, will have all of those many controls split up and down the left and right in terms of buttons, in terms of paddles, down to driver preference, and the ease of use of the most common buttons will be perhaps easiest to get to, nearest both thumbs. And the driver will have an awful lot of input as to where he feels more comfortable having those things. So it's no different really to Robert, because he will feel, I'm sure, more comfortable having most of the really important functions on his much more usable left hand, I would imagine. I mean, I don't know, I'm guessing here. Or perhaps it goes the other way, and this is something I genuinely don't know the answer to this. Perhaps it goes the other way. Perhaps he needs all of his strength in his left hand to control the steering wheel, so perhaps the buttons that he needs are actually more on the right hand side, where he can take his hand off the wheel and activate buttons. So the steering wheel layout, I'm sure, will be adapted to Robert's preferences, but that's not really any different to any other driver. It's just that Robert's preferences might be different. The up and down shifters on the back, you can easily change those to do whatever you want. It's not really a big engineering task. It's mostly software, of course, configuring what any of these buttons or paddles or switches do. So that's all really easy. Perhaps something like a brake bias shifter, or things like fire extinguisher buttons, power switches that might be split in different sides of most people's cockpits. Perhaps Robert prefers those again on one side or the other because it's a little bit easier for him to use. But that's really probably about it in terms of what you have to adapt to allow Robert to drive. And the pedal situation is perfectly the same. I think he's able to drive just as any other driver would in those kind of terms. So there's not really very much else. The driver position, the driver comfort, and the driver layout of his cockpit is a very specific and personal thing to each and every driver, and two perfectly able-bodied drivers in the same team can often have very different steering wheels or very different cockpit layouts, pedal setups. So everything is tailored for each individual driver, and that will be no different for Robert, I guess. Joe Lotuarco says, "How do teams like McLaren maintain engines from previous suppliers in their historic cars? I.e., does McLaren bring in Mercedes or Honda reps to run them on demo days? Do suppliers worry about their IP in outdated engines?" Another very good question. Yes, they do. So McLaren, for example, will bring in Mercedes to run a car that was from the McLaren Mercedes era. So in Suzuka, for example, they ran Mika Häkkinen's car, which is a brilliant sight to see. Really great to see that thing running again. And yes, they had Mercedes engineers there running the engine. It is only Mercedes who are able to run that engine because they have the software needed to run it. It's not simple as your road car as turning the key and firing it up and off it goes. It needs a team of people to start the engine on these things, and in order to do that they need to have software, the correct software, designed and written by Mercedes for that particular engine. So they have to bring them back, and it's just part of the ongoing process. Same with Honda. Are they worried about their IP in outdated engines? Not really, because it's outdated, and because the pace of development is so fast in Formula 1 that no, they're not really concerned by that. And in reality, there's no Honda engineer ever going to be taking a very close look at an old, outdated Mercedes engine from a show car. Right, we're going to finish with this one. and this is a question from Jakob Hager. Jakob Hager, apologies if that's wrong. And he says, with this lovely picture, I noticed this flap on an F1 video and have seen it on other race car wings. What's the purpose of it? To me it seems it just disrupts the airflow over the wing. Right, well, you are talking, Jakob, about what we call a Gurney flap. That little right-angled flap that sits on the trailing edge of lots of Formula 1 wings. It's called a Gurney flap because a guy called Dan Gurney invented it. He was a race car driver. He was also a team owner way back in the 60s, 70s. Apologies, my history's not great. But what it does, it's a sort of cheap way of increasing downforce on a wing. And that little Gurney flap, it tends to be about the thickness of the boundary layer that's passing over that wing. So normally somewhere between kind of, I mean, they range. You can change the depth of them, and that's a sort of setup tweak. They can range from 2 mil to 10 mil, something along those lines on a rear wing of a Formula 1 car. They tend to be stuck on with double-sided tape, so they're quick to change. And what they kind of do is they almost sort of trip up the airflow spilling off the rear of that wing, and behind that Gurney flap they create a bigger pressure difference between the high pressure airflow on top of the wing and the low pressure airflow underneath it. And because that air pressure difference becomes bigger, the two pull themselves together behind the rear wing, which means that the high pressure on top of the rear wing flap pushes down harder to try and get down to the low pressure area, if you like, behind that rear wing, generating more downforce and therefore more grip. And the key to a Gurney flap is it does that without generating a huge amount of drag. So it's cheap downforce for not very much drag. Whenever you increase downforce, there is normally a payoff for drag, and there is with this, but the sort of the extra downforce tends to outweigh the drag that you create from it. It creates, as the airflow spills over the back of that Gurney flap, it creates a sort of a swirling vortices, of course, which is going in the opposite direction to the vortices coming off the underside of the wing. Can't do that with my hands, something like that, which tends to smooth out the flow, keep the layers together, stops the two layers of underneath and over the top airflow from separating, which does then cause turbulence and drag. So it keeps them together, keeps them attached to each other for much longer, which reduces that drag and therefore makes it far more efficient. So that's what they're there for. It was discovered kind of by accident by Dan Gurney and is now an absolutely almost essential part of everybody's aerodynamic toolkit, both in motorsport. Aeroplanes have them, helicopters use them. It's become an absolutely critical thing to have because it's so effective. I hope that explains it a little bit. Right, we've rabbited on for so long today. I'm so sorry. I apologise if these videos are just getting too long on a Monday. The Ask Elvis videos I know are the longest ones I ever do, but I hope you still see value in them. If you don't, I'll stop and I'll start doing them much shorter and cram shorter answers to more questions perhaps. We'll see, let me know. Anyway, thank you very much to everybody who's put in a question this week. Much appreciated. I hope you have a great week. That's it.